This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. Ambrose was Bishop of Milan in the last quarter of the 4th century. As bishop, he was close to the Emperor Theodosius, who had a great respect for him. The author's standing was guaranteed for his works, which must therefore have been widely known. This was true for a number of works, especially the commentary on the first chapter of the Bible, the 6 days of creation, the Hexameron, and the commentary on the Gospel of Luke. Both works were conceived for the pulpit, then compiled in a volume and published after a thorough stylistic revision. He dedicated his dogmatic treatises on the Trinity to the Emperor Gratian. These treatises soon had a wide circulation. The most successful work was a commentary on Luke, which was used everywhere for preaching. Sermons taken from this work were included in medieval homiliaries. St Ambrose's success cannot be compared to St Augustine's, and neither to other great fathers of the Latin Church, St Jerome and Gregory the Great, but he does come a close fourth. Bede based his own commentary on Luke on St Ambrose's commentary. In so doing, on the one hand, he testified to the fact that the work was widespread and of an important author, but on the other, he limited his circulation by partly replacing it. There are 10 late antique manuscripts described by Law in Codices Latini Antiquiores that contain works by Ambrose. They are all presumably of Italian origin, except one. With different degrees of probability, Law suggests the area of origin as Italy. In 4 cases, the north of Italy. Law gives a more precise place of origin in 2 cases, Ravenna and Milan, and this purely on historical basis. In effect, by using palaeographical or codicological criteria for codices of the 5th and 6th century, we can at best distinguish between the north and the south of Italy. It is very difficult to recognize the production of a specific scriptorium. The surviving items are too few, while the Roman cities in Italy with schools, public offices and churches that produced manuscripts abounded. The dogmatic corpus on the Trinity, in whole or in part, has been transmitted by 4 late antique codices written in Italy, and witnesses of 2 distinct textual families. The Parisinus Latinus 8907 of the late 5th century, unique witness of one of the 2 families, had entered France by the 11th century, but the ways and times of the journey are unclear. From the 2nd family, the most ancient, a 5th century manuscript, seems to have been at St Gall at the dawn of the Carolingian age, and later at Reichenau, but again, its precise history is not known. The origin of the other one can be better traced on historical ground. It is from Ravenna, where it is still preserved. It is a magnificent 5th or 6th century manuscript in half uncial, written by 2 copyists. The text was immediately checked and revised by 2 correctors. Marginal notes in different hands show that it was read and used between the 6th and the 9th century. Of these Codices Antiquiores preserved, none can be traced back to Milan with certainty. In the textual tradition of the dogmatic treatises, the most ancient Milanese manuscript dates to the 2nd half of the 9th century. Even so, we have a report from the humanist Tobia del Borgo that in 1439 A very ancient volume, thought to be an autograph of this saint, was still preserved in the Milan Cathedral. The Milanese family, as it appears in the 9th century witnesses, derived from a late antique ancestor, probably of the 6th century, whose text was revised, divided into chapters, and each chapter numbered and provided with a heading throughout the text, a titulatio. The interesting problem regarding the titulationes in classical Latin literature has been studied. Few go back directly to the author of the text. This would seem to be the case of Pliny the Elder, Naturalis Historia. On the other hand, titulationes and chapter divisions are inserted systematically into some late antique editions of pagan classics and of Father of the Church, as described by Pierre Petit-Mangin. As for St Ambrose dogmatic treatises, titulationes already partially exist in 2 of the extant 5th century manuscripts. They were completed at a later date, with the inclusion of the numbering of the chapters. Titulationes also exist with headings and numbering in other Ambrose works. They seem to constitute the trace of a late antique edition. 3 late antique copies of the commentary on Luke have survived, probably all from the north of Italy. 2 are fragmentary. The 3rd is a volume almost complete, in a beautiful half-uncial hand of the 6th century, defined by Lowe as North Italian in type, now in the Ambrosiana and Turin libraries. This manuscript does not seem to have had descendant. This can be explained by its history. It had probably been taken to Bobbio in the pre-Carolingian age. Bobbio was an almost hermetic monastery in the Apennines that managed to save a large number of antique books, thanks to its isolation and seclusion, not being subject to visits from thieves, robbers, or scholars. The books there survived, but they also remained fruitless. They did not generate other copies. In my opinion, Milan as place of origin is suggested by the quality of the text. Milan was a writing center with non-stop activity from antiquity through the entire Middle Ages, and the cult of the Patron Saint was always kept alive, both in the basilica, where his body was buried, and in the cathedral, which was his bishop's see. Ambrose's secretary, Paulinus of Milan, who saw to the writing of his works and was later his biographer, continued to work in Milan for several more years after Ambrose's death. It is reasonable to believe, therefore, that for the 4th century onwards, the work of Ambrose would be preserved in the city and that they would be subjects of study. The manuscript presents many corrections and notes. The first annotator has written brief summaries in the margins using red ink and a gloss uncial. These are titulationes in the outer margin right. The second hand, that also uses a small gloss uncial and completes some of the titles written by the first annotator, introduces a progressive number, subdividing the text into a series of numbered chapters on the left, visible on the. This second hand also inserts many variants, which in at least one case he declares to have taken from another manuscript. In this codex, the correctors seem to explicitly keep a record of the variants obtained by collating another witness. The variants are marked both with interlinear additions and in the margin. The presence of this sort of variants characterizes the textual tradition of the work of Ambrose that were conceived for the pulpit. Lively expression of the oral style were toned down to a more formal style, but traces of the revision remain in the manuscript tradition. An interesting hand, enough uncial with cursive elements, adds numerous small corrections. Biblical quotations are marked in the margin, here Matthäus. Many notabilia are in a nice cursive hand of the 6th or early 7th century, to be compared with the famous Milanese papyrus codex of Flavius Josephus. The margins are filled with notes, and the entire text has been revised. There are more than 800 interventions in total, datable between the 6th and 9th centuries, the last ones by a Carolingian hand of Bobbio. Crossing over to the 7th century, which, with regard to Ambrose manuscripts, can be deemed almost like a desert, we find an interesting revival thanks to the monks of Luxeuil. 4 items in Luxeuil's script remain: fragments, excerpts, and a complete work, De Bono Mortis, in a manuscript preserved in Fulda. David Gantz explained how the Luxeuil books were written by the monks who were missionaries, not for use in Luxeuil, but for the communities they were converting. So the destination of their books is clear. Fulda in Germany was the land of their mission. The models they used and where they had obtained them is still an open problem, difficult to solve because they were true clerici vagantes who moved from Rome to Northern Europe. Around the year 700, a number of works by St Ambrose were being read in England too. His treatises on virginity were known to Aldhelm. Bede had read at least 8 different works, as well as a commentary on Luke, which he used as a source. A 6th century manuscript in uncial, probably Italian, which contained a series of commentaries on Old Testament books, was read and annotated by an Anglo-Saxon in the 8th century. And again, in the 8th century, probably in Northumbria, the Apologia David was copied in a book that the Anglo-Saxon missionaries then took to Fulda. It is not possible to establish exactly when and whence the Boulogne manuscript, the model of the Fulda manuscript, and the works known to Aldhelm and Bede arrived in England. At the dawn of the Carolingian Renaissance, Ambrose's works were starting to be fervently copied north of the Alps as well. The commentary on Luke and the Hexameron had parallel experiences. For both works, the first manuscript datable to the kingdom of Charlemagne were written in Corbie, seemed to be descendant from a lost late antique codex, and belonged to a textual family unknown in Italy. For the commentary on Luke, the first copy was written under the abbot of Corbie, Leutcarius, in the mid-8th century, now in St. Petersburg. Textually related is the manuscript now in Wien, copied a few decades later at the Abbey of St Amand on the border with Belgium, under the abbot Arno, who later became Bishop of Salzburg in Austria. Arno created a library at his new bishop's see, taking with him the books written at his St Amand monastery or having them copied in Austria, for the most part from northern French models. The Hexameron has a similar history. 2 manuscripts were written in the Corbie Abbey script, now in Paris and in Cambridge. Perhaps one for use of the monastery and one for another destination. Soon after, as for the commentary on Luke, a copy commissioned by Arno of Salzburg is extant. And of this textual family, no witness of which has been found in Italy, we have the Hexameron of the Palace School. Here, we could be close to Alcuin, who played a significant role in Ambrose's success. Alcuin traveled to Italy after 780, and there met Charlemagne, whom he followed to Aachen. While he was at the palace school, he was worried about the resistance to the Carolingian cultural reforms opposed by many Italian bishops, including the Bishop of Milan. So, he tried to attract the Milanese to his side by presenting Martin, the Bishop of Tours, saint and national patron of the Franks, as being a little bit Milanese. He wrote on Ambrose and Martin. He didn't make up any facts or events that were not in Ambrose's traditional biography by Paulinus of Milan, but he gave prominence to a number of small episodes related by Paulinus where Martin was involved. Martin's early years as monk in Milan and the vision in which Thecla, the virgin patron saint of Milan Cathedral, appeared to him. The endeavor to make Martin Milanese was continued by Angilbert II, the Frankish Bishop of Milan from 820 to 50, who had a golden altar placed in St Ambrose. On the altar, the basilica. On the altar were panels with sculpted episodes from St Ambrose's life, including an episode unknown to Paulinus and taken from the Liber Miraculorum of Gregory of Tours. After Martin's death at Tours, St Ambrose miraculously took part in spirit at his funeral. The same episode was portrayed in the mosaics on the apse of the basilica. The Ambrose-Martin twinning tactic worked. Martino had become a bit patron saint to the Milanese as well. A common factor had been found between Milan and the Franks. And finally, in the second quarter of the 9th century, the Caroline script started to be accepted in the scriptoria of Milan. Until that moment, only the local pre-Carolingian minuscule had been used in the Milanese region, a script called Retian by paleographer, but in fact used also in the Po Valley. The encounter between the two scripts, the local minuscule and the Caroline imported from the Frankish schools, can be seen in a manuscript containing work of St Ambrose, which is the most ancient extant witness of a Milanese textual family of the Hexameron, this Monza manuscript. The Hexameron and following treatises on the virgins were written by a single copyist in Retian minuscule. But after this section of the volume, there is another coeval section written by a different copyist with De Paradiso and De Cain. The second section is in fine Caroline script. This is one of the first Milanese manuscripts to be written in Caroline. Here, Milan can be seen to have accepted a foreign script in its patron saint texts, and so immediately joins the European circuit of Carolingian culture. Within 20 years, witnesses of this family of the Hexameron conquered southern Germany. They can be found in Freising, that's the slides. This manuscript was written at Freising, second quarter of the 9th century, in the Lake of Constance region, in the Cathedral of Augsburg, this one, written in Lombardy about 850 or a little later. The textual history of the decline makes it possible to follow the descent of the Milanese models in Europe. The work, a commentary on the fourth chapter of Genesis, which constitutes the written text of sermons given by Ambrose in the early years of his ministry, did not meet with great success. It was unknown to Cassiodorus. There are less than 60 preserved manuscripts, and the Stemma Codicum appears relatively simple. I have so far collated about half of the manuscript, all the oldest, until the 12th century, but very few from the later Middle Ages. Here the Stemma gives an idea of the manuscript I shall mention, their textual relationships, their dates, their geographic origin. A similar geographic and textual history of a work of Ambrose has been given by Michaela Zelzer for the collection of the letters. The Stemma Codicum of a work can act as guide to reconstruct its itinerary and to explain the place of origin of the witnesses. The textual links between manuscripts correspond to a history of cultural relations between the scriptoria that produced them and the people who worked there. No late antique copy of the Cain has been preserved. The archetype is a pre-Carolingian manuscript, probably from the 8th century, in scriptio continua, with very little punctuation and many phonetic errors, as was usual for the period between the 6th and the 8th century in northern Italy. The geography and the origin of its descendants place it in Milan. The oldest representative is the Monza manuscript, the second section of it, in Caroline script. Here, the division of the word is approximate, and because of the copyist's scant knowledge of grammar, there are many morphological errors. It belongs to a rather slender branch of tradition that remained alive only in the Po Valley. After Monza, other witnesses of the family are 12th century. One was preserved and probably written in the Benedictine monastery of San Salvatore in Bologna in the first half of the 12th century. The other was written about 50 years later in the Cistercian monastery of Chiaravalle della Colomba, not far from Bologna, and now in Oxford. The Cistercian communities that settled in Italy during the 12th century did not bring the books prescribed for reading by their cousins from the mother house. Instead, a scriptorium was set up in the newly founded houses. Models from nearby religious libraries were borrowed, and the necessary copies were made. In this new manuscript, a collaboration is evident between the monks who had arrived in Italy from the mother houses in France and the new Italian monks who had just entered the order. The former used a French or Norman Frühgotische style. The latter continued to use the Italian style of script, which they were used to. The second branch of the Cain tradition is more numerous and widespread. The most ancient witness is a beautiful Milanese manuscript from approximately the mid-10th century, this Siena manuscript. The Caroline script is distinctive Milanese. The textual relationship between the Monza and Siena manuscript and with the witnesses of the third family, Beta, suggests that the archetype, like the ancient Turin commentary on Luke that we saw earlier, had many interlinear variants, probably traces of a late antique edition that collected variants of different versions. The Siena manuscript was used in Milan for about a century. It was taken away after bitter struggles had broken out in Milan between factions of the clergy and the people under the leadership of Arialdo, with sentences and papal excommunications and urban warfare in the years 1050 to 1070. A Milanese canon named Andrea, who had taken part in all the battles, left Milan in 1067 after the death of Arialdo and became a monk with a new Benedictine congregation at Vallombrosa in Tuscany. He was quite learned. After just a few years in the Vallombrosa congregation, he became abbot of Strumi Abbey and wrote the biography of the founder of the congregation, St. John Gualberto. He, or one of his companions, is the ideal candidate for moving the Siena manuscript, which had numerous descendants, all Tuscan. In just a few decades, several copies were produced at Vallombrosa and used in various houses of the order and in other churches. In the 15th century, Niccolò Niccoli had one of these copies, which, together with Niccoli's entire library, later entered the Medici library. The Siena manuscript then went to the Benedictine monastery of Sant'Eugenio of Siena. In the 14th and 15th centuries, his descendants were still being produced for the Franciscans of Santa Croce in Florence and in Florence bookshops. Tommaso Parentuccelli, later Pope Nicholas, the founder of the Vatican Library, Tommaso Parentuccelli read the manuscript in Santa Croce, appreciated and annotated it. Then he commissioned to have it copied from a Florentine bookshop. The new large book, now a Vatican manuscript, collected many of St. Ambrose's works. Even the Duke of Urbino's illuminated copy of the Cain descend from the Siena manuscript. The third branch of the tradition, beside the Siena manuscript, produced other descendants. Firstly in Milan, Bita, then across the Alps. We do not know of any Carolingian or Ottonian representative of this family, but the first ones, Beta and Gamma, must have existed before the year 1000. The earliest extant witness was written at the Abbey of Saint Benigne of Dijon, and so in France at the beginning of the 11th century. Parisinus Latinus 1164, P in the stem. Saint Benigne was a new monastery founded in 989 by William, an Italian monk. The Italian scholars call him Guglielmo di Volpiano, from his place of origin in Piedmont, and the French call him Guillaume de Dijon, from the location of the Abbey of Saint Benigne, the most important of the many he founded. William, from a noble family closely related to the Count of Savoy, became a monk after meeting Maiolus of Cluny, the fourth abbot of the powerful Benedictine congregation of Cluny. In the 10th century, Cluny had brought about a great change in the Benedictine order. For the first time, a network of congregated abbeys was created, and they all owed obedience to the abbot of the mother house. This led to a drastic change for the books and the texts. In the past, a book could travel from one monastery to another, and many books were transported in this way by the monks during the early Middle Ages. However, within a monastic congregation, things were different. A text that was prescribed for reading by the customs would have to be read by all the houses of the congregation. The monastic scriptoria almost became industrial machines for the production of numerous copies. The circulation of text reached a speed never seen before. The geographical circulation of the text could be gauged by the expansion of the network of the monastery belonging to the congregation. Between them was established a form of intellectual cooperation, a systematic exchange process, as François Dolbeau clearly pointed out. I mentioned earlier the circulation of the Cain in Tuscany thanks to the promotion of the Vallombrosa congregation. The Vallombrosa monks had houses only in Italy. Cluny, on the other hand, together with the different congregations that grew within the Cluny movement, had expanded throughout Europe, and so did the text they read. Maiolus of Cluny traveled through Italy and in 987 founded a monastery obedient to Cluny in Pavia. There is documentary evidence of the presence of William of Volpiano in Cluny with Maiolus in that same year. In 989, William moved from Cluny to Dijon, where he founded Saint Benigne. Aristocratic, powerful, and great organizer, William maintained the Cluny monastic spirit, but he took action on a grand scale by founding many new monasteries and running them according to his own plans and abilities. And so he gave rise to a new congregation. Within 10 years, William was ruling over 5 abbeys in central France. In 1003, he started building the abbey at San Benigno of Frutuaria in Piedmont, near his place of birth. In the decades that followed, his congregation spread rapidly through France, from Provence to Lorraine and Normandy, to Italy, and in particular in Germany, starting from Siegburg around 1068 and later in the 12th century to Bavaria and Austria. William convinced other Italians to share the monastic life in Dijon. At times, they were secular clerics who were converted to a monastic discipline. The Chronicle of the Dijon monastery tells of a journey made by William to Italy in 996-97, from which he returned together with a group of new monks. One of these must have been Geoffrey Godefredus, Archdeacon of the Church of Milan, that is, an outstanding member of the cathedral clergy, whom the Chronicle recalls to have been in Dijon for many years together with William. Geoffrey is of interest to us at this point as the best candidate for transporting a book containing the Hexameron de Paradiso and de Cain from Milan to Dijon. The manuscript Gamma must have been a copy of the cathedral manuscript and was a witness of the Milanese text Beta. At least for the Cain, it was model for P. P, the Parisinus Latinus 11624, is a large-sized volume which contains texts copied from different models, forming a large collection of St Ambrose texts, 11 works in total, as well as some spurious writings. Several copyists worked in it. For its paleographical features, P appears to have been written in Burgundy during the first half of the 11th century, most probably at Saint Benigno of Dijon, where it was kept for centuries. Links between Dijon and Cluny were many and constant. At Cluny, the inventory made before the end of the 11th century showed the presence of 22 volumes that contained Ambrose's works. The number is extremely high and astonishing, even for the Cluny library, which was enormous and gave priority to the father of the church over any other kind of text. Many of Ambrose's works are in more than one copy. There were 2 copies of the Cain, but neither has survived. For this reason, it is not possible to identify their models or the manuscript directly derived from Cluny with certainty. Other manuscripts from this branch of tradition, the Jean-Cluny group, have instead been preserved. This group includes the Parisinus Latinus 2637, written in central France around 1100, and belonging to Saint Martial of Limoges. Saint Martial had joined the Cluny congregation in 1065. There are several codices written in French Cistercian monasteries during the second half of the 12th century, which I have not been able to collate, and therefore do not appear in this theme. Direct or indirect descendants of the Milanese book taken to Dijon are two manuscripts which I have collated. Manuscript 3874 of the second half of the 12th century, written at Clairvaux, and a Périgueux manuscript, also from the second half of the 12th century, owned by the Cadouin monastery, which became Cistercian in 1119. With Cadouin, we are in Aquitaine, almost on the Atlantic coast. St Ambrose de Cain was moving west, successfully conveyed by the Cistercian network, which by the mid-12th century had extended from Alcobaça in Portugal, which had recently been won back to the Latin culture, through to Sweden and to the Danube Valley. Both the surviving manuscript and those lost but listed in the catalogues of the Cistercian libraries show that considerable space had been given to Ambrose. The Milanese Beta, the model from the manuscript taken to Dijon, was also a model for other witnesses in Italy. A manuscript now in Vatican has the possession note Dominus Damianus. Damianus, related to the famous cardinal and writer Pier Damiani, was abbot of Nonantola in Emilia, the Po Valley, from 1089 to 1107. The manuscript may be attributed to the scriptorium of Nonantola under this abbot, a time of intensive enrichment for the monastery library. After the bitter internal conflicts of the second half of the 11th century that had even led to the burning of churches, and that for our decline had taken the Siena manuscript away from Milan and transferred it to Vallombrosa, the city started its great economic rise. The great epoch of the Lombard merchant had started, reason for which in many cities in Germany and in other European countries there is a Lombard street. The city churches, where canons were members of rich and powerful families, reaped many benefits. Even the libraries of these churches had the means to renovate the books and to show the grandeur of Milan through the praising of the Patron Saint Ambrose. Large and illuminated books were commissioned so that they would look important even to those who only saw the outside. Yet, many learned members of the clergy were not satisfied with just the external aspect and had precise opinion about the text. In the Italian cities of the period, schools were growing and improving. Not only were there the great school of law in Pavia and Bologna, schools of grammatica were now everywhere, and these schools offered a solid curriculum in the artes liberales, which included the study of ancient authors. The accessus ad autores also aimed to establish a precise list of all the works. The texts had to be authentic and correct, emendati. This new demanding school culture also affected the works of St Ambrose. A large edition of the opera Omnia of the patron was started in Milan, first in the cathedral and then in the Basilica of St Ambrose. In the Basilica, almost all the corpus has survived, and documentary evidence provides information on its production. This is the first page of the entire corpus with Ambrose portrayed as an evangelist. The provost of the church was Martino Corbo, provost from 1134 to 1152. Below, there is a portrait of Martino. He had a high opinion of his church and of himself, or at least so I believe, given the fact that he took pains to create an archive of his personal correspondence, something that at that time was only done by popes and by Bernard of Clairvaux. This collection of letters is preserved in the Basilica archives and is one of the few and extraordinary collections of original 12th century private letters existing in Europe today. Martino Corbo wanted a large edition of the works of Pope Gregory the Great for his basilica to demonstrate his obedience to the Church of Rome, and he wanted an even larger edition of all the work of St Ambrose to exalt the tradition of the Milanese Ambrosian Church. Many of the texts were already available in the basilica or in the cathedral, in the old Milanese copies of the 9th and 10th centuries. For other works, Martino looked for models everywhere, even in far places. He really wanted to collect every single one of St. Ambrose's works, and he wasn't satisfied with the first available text. He wanted the best text, emendatus. He, therefore, collated different manuscripts. His project was what we would call today a critical edition. We have evidence of this from both Martino correspondence and from an examination of the manuscripts themselves. His collaborators outside Italy were two German clerics from Regensburg, Paulus and Gebehardus. In 1126, the two clerics wrote to the Archbishop of Milan, telling him that they have found Ambrose's funeral oration for the Emperor Gratian in Verona, and to have sent it to Martino. In the same letter, they stated that they were looking for anything written by St. Ambrose, and were ready to send copies to Milan. In 1134, Paulus wrote to Martino with the news that there existed a commentary by Ambrose on the prophet Isaiah in the Cathedral Library of Reims. The news turned out to be false, and the following year, the two German clerics wrote, and this is the letter, and the script is clearly of a German hand, "We do not desist from our search yet, and so we have sent someone to look for St. Ambrose on Isaiah in Saxony, and just before that, we have sent someone to Belgium." Of course, they never did find this text, which couldn't have existed because St. Ambrose had not commented on Isaiah. Nevertheless, we cannot but admire the diligence with which the investigation was carried out. Models of different textual family can be seen in the books commissioned by Martino. The model for the Cain was Beta. There are interventions by correctors who worked immediately after the manuscript had been completed. On paleographical grounds, we can tell that the copies are all from Milan and of excellent quality. The script style is compact and regular. Several illuminators can be recognized. The main full-page illustration we have seen before have been painted by an artist who is certainly the best of the century in Milan. Other artists worked, including one quite skillful and little extravagant, who painted chicken and other animals with their feet in the air. Most of Martino Corbo collection is preserved in the Basilica nowadays. 8 volumes survive. In the corpus, Martino also included, in all modesty, a copy of his own correspondence with the German clerics regarding the search for the text. In the library of the Basilica, these manuscripts were used and often copied. Even Petrarch, when he went to Milan in the 50s of the 14th century, studied them with great interest. Other scholars read and obtained copies of Corbo's volume during the 14th and 15th centuries. A 15th century Archbishop of Milan, Francesco Pizzolpasso, who was present at the Council of Basle from 1432 to 1439, did so on a grand scale. Following the trend of the humanistic culture that was producing a profound change in the church culture too, the unabridged texts of the ancient fathers of the church were gaining importance with respect to those of modern theologians and canonists. And so, at the Council of Basle, many members took with them patristic manuscripts so that they could borrow quotations to include in their speeches. Pizzolpasso provided himself with Ambrose's opera Omnia, borrowing Corbo's books from the Basilica. In the meantime, however, he had commissioned the copy of almost half the entire collection. Only one volume of Pizzolpasso's copies survives today, kept in the Ambrosiana. Another huge volume, which also contained the Cain, is now lost, and only its mention in the inventory of his library remains. Pizzolpasso lost the Cain in the last descendant Milanese manuscript of Vita, and I am able to identify, Pizzolpasso, that's wrong. Pizzolpasso lost the Cain in the last descendant Milanese manuscript of Vita that I am able to identify is a humanistic manuscript, had to be like the other Pizzolpasso, a humanistic manuscript. In 1477, however, Corbo's Codex was at the basis of the editio princeps of the work, printed in Milan. For this edition, the ancient Monza manuscript of the 9th century was also collated. We have now reached the final branch of the manuscript tradition, which I have called Delta. Textually, the origin of Delta too seems to be connected with William of Dijon. However, I am not able to trace the exact story. The first representative is a manuscript now in Bamberg, datable to the beginning or to the first half of the 11th century, written probably in eastern France and possibly in the milieu of William of Dijon. The unusual title Liber Nonus given to the Cain could point to Cluny. A little later, there is a sister manuscript from the 11th century. The script points to Burgundy or Lorraine. Another sister manuscript dates to the late 12th century. It is probably from the same area and probably a product of a Cistercian scriptorium. Both these Brussels codices have a late possession note from the Carthusians of Zelmdienst in Belgium. Their common parents seems to have also had descendants in Austria and Bavaria in the 12th century. Firstly, in Benedictine monasteries, one in Garsten in Austria near the Danube, probably the first half of the 12th century, now in Vienna. And two, extremely interesting manuscript in Prüfening near Bamberg, now both in Munich. These last two Prüfening manuscripts are precisely datable to the decade 1160-70, and one is a direct copy of the other. The first was recorded in the Abbey Library Catalogue in 1165. The copy, this one, was made soon after in the monastery, by the pupils, as we can clearly see by the different hands and the hesitation corrected by the master. The master then used the codex as a learning platform for drawing too, supplying illustrations made with a pen. Just simple outlines, but made with a true masterly touch. The proofing school of drawing can be found in other manuscripts with different texts and has been studied by art historians. To my knowledge, this is the only copy of the Cain in an illustrated manuscript. Members of the same Delta family are the copies of the Cistercians of the monastery in Alderbach and Sittich, which follow close behind in the second half of this century and are now in Munich and Wien. I've collated very few manuscripts from the 14th and 15th centuries. However, there emerges a small group of witnesses closely connected from the textual point of view, which can be linked to Basel and to the period of the Council 1430-40. Some of the topics discussed in Basel must have been relevant to the content of the Cain, and Pizzol Passo was not the only person to make use of this text. Of this group, I will mention only two manuscripts, one of the Dominican of Basel, now in Basel, written during the decades of the Council, and which contains a large selection of patristic and medieval works and council documents. The Cain is the only work by Ambrose included here. Another manuscript from this same group, from the first half of the 15th century, is now in Prague, probably of Bohemian origin, and it combines the texts of several medieval authors and 13 works by Ambrose, including the Cain. A witness belonging to this group was the one on which Boniface Amerbach founded the Cain within his large printed edition of St Ambrose works in Basel in 1492. Amerbach was the first to print an edition of the Saint opera Omnia. The text of Amerbach was taken by Erasmus, who republished Ambrose in Basel in 1527 with highly discerning prefaces, but avowedly without a study of the manuscript tradition. There are no extant medieval copies of the Cain written in England, even if late medieval manuscripts of other works of Ambrose are quite numerous. The Cain is listed in the early 14th century Union Catalogue of Books in England, Scotland, and Wales, compiled by the Oxford Franciscans, the Registrum Angliae de Libris Doctorum. There is only one copy in the Totoniensis Benedictine House in Devon. Old catalogues and possession notes on extant volumes show that the 16th century editions of Ambrose Opera Omnia, 5 printed in Basel and 5 printed in Paris, were highly widespread. An early modern library of English cultural institution had them. The Cain circulated and potentially was read more frequently after the Middle Ages and after its inclusion in the printed edition, which are non-Milanese.